In this first example of pouring a mold, I've already sculpted and baked two medium-sized Monty type coral pieces. I'm using Smooth-On's MoldStar 15 for the majority of my molds here. In the previous coral build, I used a material called Umu for my molds, and I found that it's just too flexible to work with in this project. This MoldStar 15 is more rigid and was a lot easier to use, especially when making multiple castings. It's really expensive stuff, but the molds themselves should last really long. First, we build a form around our piece in a way that gives about a ½ inch or more all the way around it, but at the same time try not to waste any material with too large of a form. And next we'll mix up the 1-to-1 mixture. I like to measure out each part in separate cups, combine them and stir, and then pour it into another container and stir it again to make sure that we have a very well mixed batch. In this example, I'll pour about 1/4 inch of the MoldStar and then let it set a little. Then we can place the coral pieces directly onto the dried portion and pour the remainder of the mold. This will give us a fully encapsulated coral that we can cut out later. But this method takes a little more time since you have to pour 2 separate layers. And later on I'll show you an example that allows you to cast something like this all in one step. In this second example of making a mold, I'm going to sculpt some semi-flat coral pieces directly onto a flat surface. So here I'm using a piece of acrylic that I can just build my form on directly to it to cast the mold. When I cast the mold, the bottom of these corals that are touching the acrylic will not be casted, so basically the mold will cover the top and the sides. Once it's finished, we can just flip the mold over and pull out our corals easily and also cast multiple pieces at a time. Now the drawback to doing it this way is that one entire side will not have any texture to it like a fully encapsulated mold would. So the pieces that I'm sculpting will be used on the insert in a way that the untextured portion is not visible. An advantage of doing it this way is that we don't have to cut the mold open, and removing the castings are a lot easier. I'm just going to fill this piece of acrylic with random looking pieces of SPS. In this example I use a Phillips head screwdriver to texturize the pieces. I just stab at the piece randomly but carefully before heating it in the oven, and it gives the piece high and low spots like a coral in nature would have, plus random patterns. And later on when we paint the castings, these highs and lows will really help us paint with different shades of color that we choose to give it depth. And as far as the sculpting, I don't really have any tips for you because I've never taken a sculpting class, and I guess that may show. But just look at examples of real coral on the internet and try to mimic them. Once I have all my pieces sculpted, we're ready to build the form around the pieces using strips of acrylic or strips of wood, whatever you have laying around, and a hot glue gun. In this example, I did not bake the clay before casting, and you can do this as well, but most of the time I would recommend baking the clay or the coral, because when you don't, it's really tedious to remove the clay that you didn't bake. But at the same time, you can reuse that clay, so it's really up to you, but I would recommend baking it every time. It just makes it easier. Once our form is built, we can mix up our 1-to-1 material called MoldStar. Now the plastic mixture is pretty viscous and easy to stir, but the MoldStar material and the other molds that I've worked with are very thick. So stirring a large batch can be hard to get it mixed really well, so I just take a large popsicle stick and clamp it in my drill to use it as a mixer. This works pretty good for material being mixed in a 16-ounce cup. And then after pouring the mold, and it sets for about 6 hours, we can peel it out of the form and remove all of the clay pieces. For this next coral, I'm going to flatten a piece of clay and texturize it to where it resembles a sponge or some sort of tube coral. Once we cast the coral with a flexible plastic material, I will just roll it up and glue it to the insert. So to texturize this piece, I will use a sharp object to carve some lines into it, and then I use my fingers to smooth the area out to make the creases look more realistic. Then I use a small rock from a previous tank to press into the clay, giving it a rough and random texture. Once I have the texturizing done, I will pour the mold in the same manner as before, building the form around the coral and making a cast of the top and sides. It doesn't have to be too thick. I think my coral here is about 1/4 of an inch, and the mold casting ended up about 3/4 of an inch. And once it's dry, we can peel the clay off and we're ready to cast some tube coral. In this last example of this same type of mold, I'm going to sculpt some pieces that will give a little bit of height for the tank. This first one looks kind of like a sea fan of some sort, and the other one resembles seaweed or maybe a spongy coral that probably doesn't exist. And then to texturize these pieces, I used the top side of a cheap paintbrush that comes to a rounded point. I just poked it a couple hundred times and it gives the coral some pretty good character. Then we would just cast the mold in the same way as before and remove our pieces after it's done. For these last two examples, I will use a similar casting method with forms that don't need to be built. This first one you see me sculpting is some type of finger coral, or maybe it even resembles an anemone. It won't be moving around though. And to start with, I just roll out some clay and cut them into shorter pieces and use toothpicks broken in half to attach them as kind of like tentacles onto the body of the coral. Then I use a flat scraper tool to smooth out where the pieces meet, and that pretty much finishes this one. For these last coral pieces, I just shaped them as some small random bowls of SPS coral. Once I have the basic shape down, I use a piece of rock to press into the clay as a texturizer. Then I'll bake all these pieces before casting the mold itself. For these mold castings, I'm going to use some clear containers I had laying around as their form. Usually you can reuse these forms, but sometimes you have to cut it off like I do here in this video. These pieces are being casted on the top and sides only again, so we can just flip the mold over and make our plastic castings easy. In order to get this finger coral out of the mold, you have to cut the mold itself. Here I made 4 slits equal distance apart, only as low as I have to go in order to remove the coral. Even though we cut the mold, it will go right back together where it should be once you remove everything. I guess I didn't record video of myself making 360-degree castings, but basically I would do the same thing you just saw and use large staples pushed through a piece of painter's tape to use as a skeletal frame. With 2 staples, you get 4 points of contact to hold the coral, and the staples aren't big enough to mess with your plastic castings once you remove them, and they'll obviously be casted into the material itself, but it won't affect anything. And this allows you to make a fully encapsulated mold in one pour. That's all the examples of creating molds for coral castings. It's a pretty simple but time-consuming process, but remember, I'm an amateur at this, not a professional, so if you do something based on this video and you hate it, you wasted money, that's your own damn fault. I'm not taking responsibility for it. But now let's take a look at the plastic casting process and make some corals with our molds. Now that we've spent a couple $100s and 50+ hours of our time, it's finally time to show something for it by casting some corals. Casting the plastic corals is pretty easy using Smooth-On's SmoothCast product line of plastics. I use several different SmoothCasts throughout these videos, so just watch for the graphic that tells you which material is being used. In this very first casting, I'm using something they call Color Match SmoothCast 327 that allows you to use the So Strong dyes in the clear part of the mixture to achieve whatever color you want. And the color that you mix in there is what you get at the end of the result of casting. Other products like SmoothCast 300 that I use will be clear, but then when it reacts, it'll be a bright white combined with whatever color you put in there. This is not ideal for casting corals since you want good control over the color, but I use it anyway because I had a gallon of it sitting around, and the multiple layers of paint later on will cover the original color anyway. So first I added some white dye to make the casting more opaque, then some red and purple, giving us this dark maroonish looking purple. And then I combine the 2 equal parts and mix for about 20 seconds, then pour into another clean cup, stir a little more. Here I'm making castings into some fully encapsulated molds, and you can see the hole that I cut at the top of the mold to pour into. You should try to make the hole come through at the highest part of the coral being casted. Before pouring, you may want to place something like the weights you see here on top of the molds to ensure a good seal with no leaks. It doesn't have to be real heavy, just enough for some pressure. And most of my molds don't even need this, but I do it anyway. Also, you can see I have a few different molds here. Some of them are MoldStar 16 that I had sitting around. The real blue one is Umu, and the other one is the previously used MoldStar 15. Begin pouring the plastic slowly, allowing for it to flow into all the spaces of the mold. Once you've reached the top, try not to give it too much overflow, since you'll have to remove that later. And once you've casted the corals, you need to try to shake or vibrate the mold a little to help get any trapped air out if your particular coral causes that. After waiting for the corals to harden, we're ready to remove the castings from the molds. This is usually pretty easy, even if you didn't use mold release spray before you casted. Just open the mold up and remove the casting the same way you removed the original clay coral. Once I have the castings out, I like to use a Dremel tool with a sanding bit to knock off any of the extra plastic that came with the casting. And that's all there really is to casting the corals. You can use a variety of these different plastics with the molds, and you can also use whatever color you want. Here are a few more examples of castings I made during this process, making various colored corals. You can also see what I did with the flat sponge-like coral. For this one I used a material called SmoothCast 60D. This material is pretty flexible, allowing for us to curl the casting and glue it in place to create a sponge-like piece. This sums up the video on making molds and casting corals. And once you have several molds made, you can cast a bunch of corals fairly quickly and in a variety of colors, giving you plenty of options when attaching the corals to the insert. In the next video, I will cover how I attach the corals to the insert, painting everything and showing you the final product. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.